Good morning. Today I'm going to read the fourth segment of Dr. C.G. Jung's essay entitled Flying Saucers, a Modern Myth of Things Flying in the Skies, or something. What is it? What's the full name? A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies. And so I'm going to read today from the third dream. Now, previously in the first two sessions, we read about UFOs as rumors. This part of the essay is about UFOs in dreams. There's still two other major parts of this essay. It still has 80 pages to go, which I'm doing my best to include because, much to my surprise, this essay is quite important. I had avoided it over the last couple of years because I'm thinking, UFOs, that's a little airy-fairy. Why would I encourage people to think that Dr. Jung is strange? But it's actually not about UFOs per se. It's not about UFOs in the physical world. It's about UFOs in the psyche. And since it was written in 1958, it's near the end of Dr. Jung's life. And so he was using the opportunity of writing about UFOs to cover some of the very major ideas in his psychology. And so I have been personally surprised as I've been reading it how strange it is. Or not how strange it is, how important it is as a psychological discussion. And anyway, I'm just looking at a note from one of our frequent users, but I think I should leave that until later. I apologize for being distracted here. And so anyway, I'm going to go ahead and read these 17 or so pages, which is going to cover dreams number 3 and 4. And I think as I read, you will start to understand why this is important for all of Jung's psychology, all of Dr. Jung's psychology. So I'm beginning with paragraph 666. Dream number 3. This dream is an excerpt from a longer dream which a 42-year-old woman patient recorded about 6 years ago. At the time, she had heard nothing of flying saucers and the like. She dreamt she was standing in a garden when suddenly the humming of an engine became audible overhead. She sat down on the garden wall in order to see what was going on. A black metallic object appeared and circled over her. It was a huge flying spider made of metal, with great dark eyes. It was round in shape and was a new and unique aeroplane. From the body of the spider there issued a solemn voice, loud and distinct. It uttered a prayer that was intended as an admonition and a warning to everybody, for those on earth as well as for the occupants of the spider. The gist of the prayer was, quote, "Lead us downwards and keep us safe below. Carry us up to the height," unquote. Adjoining the garden was a large administrative building where international decisions were being taken. Flying incredibly low, the spider passed along the windows of the building for the obvious purpose of letting the voice influence the people inside and point out the way to peace, which was the way to the inner secret world. They were to take reconciling decisions. There were several other spectators in the garden. She felt somewhat embarrassed because she was not fully clothed. Commentary on dream number 3. Paragraph 667. In the preceding part of the dream, the dreamer's bed had stood close to the garden wall. In her dream, therefore, she had slept under the open sky and been exposed to the free influences of nature, which means psychologically the impersonal, collective unconscious, for this forms the counterparts of our natural environments and is always projected upon it. The wall denotes a barrier separating the immediate world of the dreamer from a more distant one, the administrative building. A round metallic object appears, described as a flying spider. This description fits the UFOs. As regards the designation spider, we are reminded of the hypothesis that UFOs are a species of certain insects. To the speculative mind, there is nothing inherently impossible in the idea that under other conditions, nature could express her knowledge in quite other ways than those mentioned earlier. For instance, instead of light-producing insects, she might evolve creatures capable of anti-gravity. In any case, our technological imagination often lags a long way behind nature's. Everything in our experience is subject to the law of gravity, with one great exception, the psyche, which, as we experience it, is weightlessness itself. The psychic object and gravity are, to the best of our knowledge, incommensurable. They seem to be different in principle. The psyche represents the only opposite of gravity known to us. It is anti-gravity in the truest sense of the word. In corroboration of this, we could cite the parapsychological experience of levitation and other psychic phenomena denied only by the ignorant, which relativize time and space. Obviously, the flying spider is based on an unconscious fantasy of this kind. In the UFO literature, too, reference is made to flying spiders in an attempt to explain the alleged rain of threads in Oleron and Gaelic. He's referring to a book entitled The Truth About Flying Saucers by Michelle Aimee. Note that the dream cannot help making a concession to modern technological fantasies. It calls the spider a new and unique aeroplane. The psychic nature of the spider is shown by the fact that it contains a voice, evidently issuing from something like a human being. This curious phenomenon reminds one of similar occurrences in insane people who can hear voices issuing from anything or anybody. Voices, like visions, are autonomous manifestations of the senses caused by the activity of the unconscious. Voices from the ether also occur in the UFO literature. Emphasis is laid on the eyes, which denote seeing and the intention to see. The intention is expressed by the voice, whose message is addressed both to the earth dwellers and to the occupants of the spider. The association with airplane here gives rise to the illogical idea of a machine that transports passengers. The passengers are evidently thought of as a quasi-human, for the messages meant for them as well as for human beings. We can therefore suppose that both are simply different aspects of man, e.g., for example, the empirical man below on earth and the spiritual man in heaven. Paragraph 671. The cryptic message or prayer is spoken by a single voice, by a kind of prayer leader. He addresses himself to that which leads and carries, and this must be the spider. We are therefore obliged to examine the symbol of the spider somewhat more closely. As we know, although this animal is quite harmless in our latitudes, it is for many people an object of horror and superstitious belief. When someone is not quite right in the head, we say in German that he spins and his cobwebs in the attic. Spiders, like all animals that are not warm-blooded or have no cerebrospinal nervous system, function in dreams as symbols of a profoundly alien psychic world. So far as I can see, they express contents which, though active, are unable to reach consciousness. They have not yet entered the sphere of the cerebrospinal nervous system, but are as though lodged in the deeper lying sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. In this connection, I remember the dream of a patient who had the greatest difficulty in conceiving the idea of the superordinate totality of the psyche and felt the utmost resistance to it. He had picked up the idea from one of my books, but, characteristically enough, was unable to distinguish between the ego and the self, and because of his hereditary taint, was threatened with a pathological inflation. In this situation, he dreamt that he was rummaging about in the attic of his house, looking for something. In one of the attic windows, he discovered a beautiful cobweb with a large garden spider sitting in the center. It was of a blue color, and its body sparkled like a diamond. The dreamer was deeply impressed by this dream, and it was, in fact, an impressive commentary on his identification with the self, all the more dangerous in view of his heredity. In such cases, there is a real weakness of the ego, which cannot therefore afford any suggestion of taking second place, as that would fatally emphasize its littleness and has to be avoided at all costs. Illusions, however, are inimical to life because they are unhealthy and sooner or later trip you up. The dream, therefore, attempts a kind of corrective, which, like the Delphic oracle, turns out to be ambivalent. It says, in effect, "What is troubling you in the head, Attic?" It says, in effect, quote, "What is troubling you in the head is, though you may not know it, a rare jewel. It is like an animal that is strange to you, forming symbolically the center of many concentric circles, reminiscent of the center of the large or small world, like the eye of God in medieval pictures of the universe," unquote. Here he had put in parentheses the word attic after head. So what is troubling you in the attic or in the head? Confronted with this, a healthy mind would fight against identification with the center because of the danger of paranoid God-likeness. Anyone who gets into this spider's net is wrapped around like a cocoon and robbed of his own life. He is isolated from his fellows so that they can no longer reach him, nor he them. He lives in the loneliness of the world creator, who is everything and has nothing outside of himself. If, on top of all this, you have had an insane father, there is the danger that you will begin to spin yourself, and for this reason, the spider has a sinister aspect that should not be overlooked. Paragraph 673. The round metallic spider of our dreamer probably has a similar meaning. It has obviously devoured a number of human beings already, or their souls, and might well be a danger to earth dwellers. That is why the prayer, which recognizes the spider as a divine being, requests it to lead the souls downwards and keep them safe below, because they are not yet departed spirits, but living earthly creatures. As such, they are meant to fulfill their earthly existence with conviction and not allow themselves any spiritual inflation. Otherwise, they will end up in the belly of the spider. In other words, they should not set the ego in the highest place and make it the ultimate authority, but should ever be mindful of the fact that it is not sole master in its own house and is surrounded on all sides by the factor we call the unconscious. What this is in itself, we do not know. We know only its paradoxical manifestations. It is our business to understand nature, and it is not good getting impatient with her because she is so complicated and awkward. Not so very long ago, there were medical authorities who did not believe in bacteria and consequently allowed 20,000 young women to die of easily avoided puerperal fever in Germany alone. Let me read that sentence again. Not so very long ago, there were medical authorities who did not believe in bacteria and consequently allowed 20,000 young women to die of easily avoidable puerperal fever in Germany alone. The psychic catastrophes caused by the mental inertia of experts do not appear in any statistics, and from this it is concluded that they are non-existent. Dr. Jung was always very favorable towards statistics. Not. Okay. Paragraph 674. The exhortation to remain below on earth is immediately followed by the paradoxical request, carry us up to the height. One might think of the saying in Faust, quote, "Then to the depths, I could as well say height, it's all the same," unquote. Were it not that the dreamer has clearly separated the two processes by a hiatus, this shows that it is a sequence and not a coincidentia oppositorum. Evidently, a moral process is envisioned, a katabasis and anabasis. The 7 steps downwards and the 7 steps upwards, the immersion in the crater, followed by the ascent to the heavenly generation in the transformation mysteries. Okay, the crater in alchemy is the vase or cauldron, and it actually is our psyche. The Mass, too, begins with the Confiteor, qua peccavi nimis. Apparently one has to be led downwards because it is not easy for people to descend from their heights and remain below. In the first place, a loss of social prestige is feared, and in the second, a loss of moral self-esteem when they have to admit their own darkness. Hence, they avoid self-criticism to an amazing degree, preach to others, and know nothing of themselves. They are happy to possess no self-knowledge, because then nothing disturbs the rosy glow of illusions. Below means that the bedrock of reality, which despite all self-deceptions is there right enough. To go down to this and remain there seems to be a matter of pressing importance if it is assumed that people today are living above their proper level. An inference of such general scope is permitted by the dream, which shows the problem in terms of a human group, and therefore characterizes it as a collective problem. Actually, the dream has the whole of humanity in view, for the spider flies as near as possible to the windows of a building where international decisions are being taken. It tries to influence the meeting and point the way that leads to the inner world, the way of self-knowledge. The dream expects that this will make peace possible. Accordingly, the spider plays the role of a savior who warns and brings a healing message. Paragraph 675. At the end, the dreamer discovers that she is insufficiently clothed. This very common dream motif usually indicates lack of adaptation or relative unconsciousness of the situation in which one finds oneself. This reminder of one's own fallibility and negligence is particularly appropriate at a time when other people are being enlightened, for in such cases there is always a lurking danger of inflation. The admonition to remain below has in our day given rise to theological apprehensions in various quarters. It is feared that this kind of psychology will result in a loosening of moral standards. Psychology, however, gives us a clearer knowledge not only of evil but also of good, and the danger of succumbing to the former is considerably less than when you remain unconscious of it. Nor is psychology always needed if you want to know evil. No one who goes through the world with open eyes can ignore it. Moreover, he is not so likely to fall into a pit as the blind man. Just as the investigation of the unconscious is suspected by theologians of Gnosticism, so an inquiry into the ethical problems it raises is accused of antinomianism and libertinism. No one in his right senses would suppose that after a thorough confession of sin accompanied by repentance, he will never sin again. Let me read that again with emphasis. No one in his right senses would suppose that after a thorough confession of sin accompanied by repentance, he will never sin again. It is 1,000 to 1 that he will sin again the very next minute. Deeper psychological Deeper psychological insight shows, in fact, that one cannot live at all without sinning in thought, word, and deed. Only an exceedingly naive and unconscious person could imagine that he is in a position to avoid sin. Psychology can no longer afford childish illusions of this kind. It must ensue the truth and declare the unconscious is not only no excuse, but is actually one of the most heinous sins. Human law may exempt it from punishment, but nature avenges herself the more mercilessly, for it is nothing to her whether a man is conscious of his sin or not. We even learn from the parable of the unjust steward that the Lord praised his servant who kept a false account because he had done wisely, not to speak of the expurgated passage at Luke 6, where Christ says to the defiler of the Sabbath, "Man, if indeed thou knowest what thou doest, thou art blessed. But if thou knowest not, thou art accursed and a transgressor of the law." Now keep in mind, this is a passage that was removed from the Bible at some point. So it appears in complete versions of the Bible. Paragraph 677. Increased knowledge of the unconscious brings a deeper experience of life and greater consciousness, and therefore confronts us with apparently new situations that require ethical decision. These situations, of course, always existed, but they were not clearly grasped, either intellectually or morally, and were often left in a not unintentional half-light. In this way, one provides oneself with an alibi and can get out of an ethical decision. But with deeper self-knowledge, one is often confronted with the most difficult problems of all, namely conflicts of duty, which simply cannot be decided by any moral precepts, neither those of the Decalogue, nor of other authorities, the Decalogue being the Ten Commandments. This is where ethical decisions really begin, for the mere observance of a codified "thou shalt not" is not in any sense an ethical decision, but merely an act of obedience and, in certain circumstances, a convenient loophole that has nothing to do with ethics. In my long life, I have never encountered a situation that made a denial of ethical principles easier for me or raised the slightest doubt in this regard. On the contrary, the ethical problem was sharpened with increasing experience and insight, and the moral responsibility became more acute. It has become clear to me that, in contrast to the general view, unconsciousness is no excuse, but is far rather a transgression in the literal sense of the word. And so I would just observe at this point that this is basically why it is difficult to individuate, because the more you know, the more you have to face ethical decisions and therefore conflicts of duty. Although there are, as mentioned above, allusions to this problem in the Gospels, the Church has, for understandable reasons, not taken it up, but left the Gnostics to tackle it more seriously. As a result, Christians rely on the doctrine of privatio boni and always think they know what is good and what is evil, thus substituting the moral code for the truly ethical decision, which is a free one. Morality consequently degenerates into legalistic behavior, and the felix culpa remains stuck in the Garden of Eden. Let me just comment here, for those of you that may not be familiar with this, that privatio boni is what the Church pursued for nearly 2,000 years, which is that God is all good and not evil, and there's no evil. There's only the privation of good, which suggests that Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin just didn't get enough mothering. And obviously Dr. Jung is very aware of that and pointing out that we have to realize that there is evil everywhere. And so he's talking about morality degenerating into legalistic behavior, where you say, oh, that law is this and that law is that, so you can't do that. And the problem is that that doesn't control everything. And then when he's referring to felix culpa, that means happy fault, which remains in the Garden of Eden. And so let me read that sentence again to you so you hear that in the context of these definitions I just provided. As a result, Christians rely on the doctrine of privatio boni and always think they know what is good and what is evil, thus substituting the moral code for the truly ethical decision, which is a free one. Morality consequently degenerates into legalistic behavior, and the felix culpa remains stuck in the Garden of Eden. We are surprised at the decay of ethics in our century, and we contrast the standstill in this field with the progress of science and technology. But nobody is worried by the fact that the real ethos has disappeared behind a mass of moral precepts. An ethos, however, is a difficult thing that cannot be formulated and codified. It is one of those creative irrationalities upon which any true progress is based. It demands the whole man and not just a differentiated function. this sort of points up the difficulties with Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules of Life, because if you're going to be an ethical person, you have to control that from the irrational part of your being, not the rational part. And so just following the rules doesn't make you ethical. Paragraph 678. The differentiated function undoubtedly depends on man, on his diligence, patience, perseverance, his striving for power, and his native gifts. With the aid of these things, he gets on in the world and develops. From this, he has learnt that development and progress depend on man's own endeavors, his will and ability. But that is only one side of the picture. The other side shows man as he is and as he finds himself to be. Here he can alter nothing because he is dependent on factors outside his control. Here he is not the doer, but a product that does not know how to change itself. He does not know how he came to be a unique individual he is, and he has only the scantest knowledge of himself. Until recently, he even thought that his psyche consisted of what he knew of himself and was a product of the cerebral cortex. The discovery of the unconscious psychic processes more than 50 years ago, now 100 years ago, is still far from being common knowledge, and its implications are still not recognized. Modern man still does not realize that he is entirely dependent on the cooperation of the unconscious, which can actually cut short the very next sentence he proposes to speak. He is unaware that he is continuously sustained by something, while all the time he regards himself exclusively as the doer. He depends on and is sustained by an entity he does not know, but of which he has intimations that occurred to, or as we can more fitly say, revealed themselves to long-forgotten forebears in the gray dawn of history. Whence did they come? Obviously from the unconscious processes, from that so-called unconscious, which still precedes consciousness in every new human life, as the mother precedes the child. The unconscious depicts itself in dreams and visions, as it always did, holding before us images which, unlike the fragmented functions of consciousness, emphasize facts that relate to the unknown whole man, and only apparently to the function which interests us, to the exclusion of all else. Although dreams usually speak the language of our particular specialism, they refer to the whole, or at the very least to what man also is, namely the utterly dependent creature he finds himself to be. Paragraph 679. In his striving for freedom, man feels an almost instinctive aversion to this kind of knowledge, for he fears, not without reason, its paralyzing effect. He may admit that this dependence on unknown powers exists, no matter what they are called, but he turns away from them as speedily as possible, as from a threatening obstacle. So long as everything appears to go well, this attitude may even be an advantage, but things do always turn out for the best. But things do not always turn out for the best, particularly today, when despite euphoria and optimism, we feel a tremor running through the foundation of our world. Our dreamer is certainly not the only person to feel afraid. Accordingly, the dream depicts a collective need and utters a collective warning that we should descend to earth and not rise up again unless the spider carries up those who have remained below. For when the functionalism dominates consciousness, it is the unconscious that contains the compensatory symbol of wholeness. This is represented by the flying spider, which alone is capable of carrying up the one-sidedness and fragmentariness of the conscious mind. There is no development upwards unless it is facilitated by the unconscious. The conscious will alone cannot compel this creative act, and in order to illustrate this, the dream chooses the symbol of prayer. Since according to the Pauline view, we do not rightly know what we should pray for, the prayer is no more than a groaning in travail, Romans 8:22, which expresses our impotence. This enjoins on us an attitude that compensates the superstitious belief in man's will and ability. At the same time, the spider image denotes a regression of religious ideas to the theriomorphic symbol of supreme power, a reversion to the long-forgotten stage where a monkey or a hare personified the Redeemer. Okay, when we're talking about theriomorphic, where theriomorphic means turned into animal state. So let me read the sentence again so it's clearer. At the same time, the spider image denotes a regression of religious ideas to the theriomorphic symbol of supreme power, a reversion to the long-forgotten stage where a monkey or a hare personifies the Redeemer. Today, the Christian Lamb of God, or the dove of the Holy Ghost, has, at most, the value of a metaphor. As against this, it must be emphasized that in dream symbolism, animals refer to instinctual processes which play a vital part in animal biology. It is these processes which determine the shape of life of an animal. For his everyday life, man seems to need no instincts, especially when he is convinced of the sovereign power of his will. He ignores the meaning of instinct and values it to the point of atrophy, not seeing how much he endangers his very existence through loss of instinct. When, therefore, dreams emphasize instinct, they are trying to fill a perilous gap in our adaptation to life. Deviations from instinct show themselves up in the form of effects, which in dreams are likewise expressed by animals. Hence, uncontrolled effects are rightly regarded as bestial or primitive and should be avoided, but we cannot do this without repressing them, that is, without splitting of consciousness. In reality, we can never escape their power. Somewhere or other they will continue to operate even though they cannot be found in consciousness. At worst, they manifest themselves in a neurosis or in an unconscious arrangement of inexplicable mishaps. The saint, who seems exempt from these weaknesses, pays for his immunity with suffering and abnegation of the earthly man, without which, of course, he would not be a saint. The lives of holy men show that the two sides cancel out. None can escape the chain of suffering that leads to sickness, old age, and death. We can and should, for the sake of our humanity, control our effects and keep them in check, but we should know that we have to pay dearly for it. The choice of currency in which we wish to pay the tribute is sometimes even left to us. Remaining down below and subordinating ourselves to a theriomorphic symbol, which seems very like an insult to our human dignity, means no more than that we should remain conscious of these simple truths and never forget that in point of anatomy and psychology, the earthly man, for all his high flights, is first cousin of the anthropoids. Should it be granted to him, however, to develop into something higher without crippling his nature, he is reminded that this transformation is not his to command, for he is dependent on factors he cannot influence. He must content himself with a prayerful yearning and groaning in the hope that something may carry him upward, since he is not likely to make a success of this Munchausen experiment. Through this attitude, he constellates helpful, at the same time dangerous, powers in the unconscious. Helpful if he understands them, dangerous if he misunderstands them. Whatever names he may give to these creative powers and potentialities within him, their actuality remains unchanged. No one can stop a religious-minded person from calling them gods or demons, or simply God, for we know from experience that they act just like that. If certain people use the word matter in this connection, believing that they have said something, we must remind them that they have merely replaced an X by a Y and are no further forward than before. The only certain thing is our profound ignorance, which cannot even know whether we have come nearer to the solution of the great riddle or not. Nothing can carry us beyond an it seems as if, except the perilous leap of faith, which we must leave to those who are gifted and graced for it. Every real or apparent step forward depends on an experience of facts, the verification of which, as we know, one of the most difficult tasks confronting the human mind. Now, I would just comment that what Dr. Jung is expressing here is exactly what's happened in the Roman Catholic Church because of its celibacy, because priests and nuns can't be cut off from their unconscious instinct through celibacy and have that be the final say, because the unconscious has the final say. Therefore, celibacy is a fool's errand, as we've seen, much to the damage of many young people around the world. And so let me just read a little bit of this again, just to re-emphasize this point. The saint who seems exempt from these weaknesses pays for his immunity with suffering and abnegation of the earthly man, without which, of course, he would not be a saint. Now, so the point is that if you're celibate, you're paying for giving up sexuality very painfully, because your instincts are telling you to do something else. And yes, you would be a saint if you could completely avoid your sexuality, but obviously thousands of priests and bishops have not been able to be saints. And this comes up in every religion where there's celibacy. Religious persons need to review what really is happening here psychologically and make the necessary changes. And it seems to me that the Roman Catholic Church has made a serious mistake from a psychological point of view by insisting on continuing celibacy. And that's just the opinion of a Protestant, so, or let's say that's the opinion of a lapsed Protestant. Let's see, we're 45 minutes into this. Okay, we'll go on. Dream 4, paragraph 862. While I was engaged on this paper, an acquaintance from abroad unexpectedly sent me a dream he had on May 27th, 1957. Our relationship was limited to one letter each every 1 or 2 years. He was an amateur astrologer and was interested in the question of synchronicity. He knew nothing of my preoccupation with UFOs, nor did he connect his dream in any way with the theme that interested me. His sudden and unusual decision to send me the dream comes rather into the category of meaningful coincidences, which statistical prejudice dismisses as irrelevant. Paragraph 683. This is the dream. It was late afternoon or early evening, the sun low on the horizon, the sky was cloudy, and there was a veil of cloud over the sun, which did not, however, prevent one from seeing quite clearly his disk in outline behind the cloud. Under such circumstances, the sun was white. Suddenly he took on an aspect of extraordinary pallor. The whole western horizon became a dreadful pale white, and the pallor is the word that I want to stress, of the orb of day became a terrifying wanness. Then a second sun appeared in the west, about the same distance above the horizon, only a little more to the north. But as we gazed intently at the sky, there were a great number of people spread over a wide area watching the heavens as I was. The second sun took on the distinctive form of a sphere in contrast with the sun's disk, or apparent disk. Simultaneously with the setting of the sun and the advent of night, the sphere came speeding toward the earth. With the coming of night, the whole potential of the dream was changed, whereas words like pallor and wanness exactly described the vanishing life, strength, and potential of the sun. The sky now assumed an aspect of strength and majesty, which inspired not fear, but awe. I could not say that I saw any stars, but the night sky was of that kind when thin wreaths of cloud allow an occasional star to be seen. The night certainly spoke of majesty, power, and beauty. When the sphere approached the earth at high velocity, I thought at first that it was Jupiter in aberration from its proper orbit, but as the sphere came nearer, I saw that, though large, it was much too small for Jupiter, and it now became possible to discern markings on its surface, which were lines of longitude, and like such, but were decorative and symbolic in character rather than geographical and mathematical. The beauty of the sphere, a subdued gray or opaque white against the night sky, must be emphasized. When we became aware that the sphere must certainly make a terrific impact upon the earth, we did, of course, feel fear, but it was fear in which awe was more predominant. It was a most awe-inspiring cosmic phenomenon. As we gazed, another and yet another sphere emerged from the horizon and sped towards the earth. Each sphere did in turn crash much as a bomb would crash, but at such a considerable distance that I, at least, could not make out the nature of the explosion or detonation or whatever it was. I think in one case, at least, I saw a flash. These spheres, then, were falling at intervals all around, and all of them well beyond the point at which they might annihilate us. There appeared to be a danger of shrapnel. Then I must have gone indoors, for I found myself talking to a girl seated in a wicker chair with an open, large-paged notebook on her lap, much engrossed in her work. We were going, the rest of us, I think in a southwesterly direction, perhaps seeking safety, and I said to the girl that she should not better come with us. I said to the girl, had she not better come with us? The danger appeared to be great, and we could hardly leave her alone. She was quite definite in her reply. No, she would remain where she was and go on with her work. It was equally dangerous everywhere, and one place was just as safe as another. I saw at once that she had reason and common sense on her side. The dream ends by my being confronted with another girl, or quite possibly the same very competent and self-possessed young lady that I had left sitting in the wicker chair absorbed in her work. This time she was rather bigger and more realistic, and I could see her face, and at least that she was addressing me fairly and squarely. And she said in extraordinarily distinct tones, J space S space, you will live till 11/8. Nothing could surpass the clarity with which these 8 words were articulated. Her authoritative way of enunciating them seemed to imply that I was to be censured for not supposing that I should live till 11/8. Dreamer's Commentary, paragraph 684. This elaborate description was followed by the dreamer's comments, which can give us a number of hints as regards interpretation. As we should expect, he sees a climax in the sudden change of mood at the beginning of the dream, when the death-frightening pallor and wanness of the sunset changes into the somber majesty of the night, and fear to awe. This, he said, was connected with his present preoccupation with the political future of Europe. On the basis of his astrological speculations, he feared the coming of a world war in 1960 to 66. He had even felt impelled to write a letter to an eminent statesman expressing his fears. Afterwards, he made the not uncommon discovery that his previously apprehensive and agitated mood suddenly changed into one of remarkable calm and even indifference, as though the whole affair no longer concerned him. All the same, he could not explain to himself why the initial terror should be superseded by such a solemn and, as it were, holy mood. He felt certain, however, that it was a collective and not a personal matter, and he asked himself, quote, are we to suppose that by hanging on too earnestly to the daylight of civilization, we lose all potential, and that as we advance into what looks a fearful night, there is more prospect of strength? Unquote. It is not very easy to fit the qualifying epithet, majesty, into such an interpretation. He himself related it to the fact that the things that come from outer space are utterly beyond our control. We might put it in theistic language by saying that it is utterly impossible to know the counsels of God, and that in eternity the night is as significant as the day. Therefore, our only possible chance is to accept the rhythm of eternity as night and day, and so the inexorable majesty of the night would become a source of strength. Evidently, the dream underlines this characteristic defeatism by the cosmic interlude of a stellar bombardment to which mankind is helplessly exposed. Paragraph 686. The dream contains no trace of sexuality if, as the dreamer said, we disregard the meeting with the young lady, as if every relationship to the opposite sex was always necessarily based on sexuality. What disturbed him was the fact that the meeting took place at night. One can carry sex consciousness too far, as this remark shows. The wicker chair is not exactly inviting in this respect, and for the dreamer himself it signified an excellent condition for concentrated mental work, as indicated also by the notebook. As the dreamer was an ardent student of astrology, the combination of numbers 11 and 8 set him in a special problem. He thought of Roman numeral 11, 8, as the month and day of his decease. Being an elderly man of more than 70 years and 10, he was thoroughly justified in such reflections. His astrological calculations led him to relegate this fatal November to the year 1963, the middle of the conjectural World War. But he added cautiously that he was by no means sure. The dream, he said, left behind a strange feeling of contentment and of thankfulness that such an experience had been vouchsafed to him. It was indeed a big dream, for the like of which many a man has been thankful, even if he did not understand it correctly. Okay, so that was his commentary. Now, Dr. Jung's commentary. Commentary to Dream 4. The dream begins with a sunset when the sun is hidden by clouds so that all one can see is a disk. This should emphasize the round form, a tendency confirmed by the appearance of a second disk, Jupiter, more round bodies in large numbers, things from outer space. For these reasons, the dream comes into the category of psychic UFO phenomena. The uncanny pallor of the sun is indicative of the fear that spreads over the daylight world in anticipation of catastrophic events to come. These events, much in contrast to his daylight views, are of unearthly origin. Jupiter, the father of gods, seems to have left his orbit and is approaching the Earth. We meet this motif in Schreber's memoirs. The extraordinary happenings going on all around him compel God to move nearer to the Earth. The unconscious interprets the threat as a divine intervention, which manifests itself in the appearance of smaller replicas of the great Jupiter. The dreamer does not draw the obvious conclusion about UFOs and does not seem to have been influenced in his choice of symbols by any conscious concern with them. Although to all appearances a cosmic catastrophe is about to happen, the fear changes into a positive mood of a solemn, holy, and reverent kind, as is fitting for an epiphany. For the dreamer, however, the coming of the god signalizes extreme danger. The heavenly bodies explode on the earth like huge bombs, thus bearing out his fear of a world war. Remarkably enough, they do not cause the expected earthquake, and the detonations seem to be of a strange and unusual nature. No destruction takes place in the vicinity of the dreamer. The hits are so far below the horizon that all he thinks he can see is a single flash. The collision with these planetoids is therefore infinitely less dangerous than it would be in reality. The main point here seems to be fear of the possibility of a third world war, and it is this that gives the scene its terrifying aspect. It is the dreamer's own interpretation, rather than the phenomenon itself, which causes him to be so agitated. Consequently, the whole affair assumes a markedly psychological aspect. This is immediately borne out by the meeting with the young lady, who keeps her composure, imperturbably goes on with her work, the prophecies, and prophesies the date of his death. She does this in so solemn and impressive a manner that he even feels it necessary to emphasize the number of the words she uses, namely 8. That this number is more than mere chance is proved by the supposed date of death, the 8th of November. This double emphasis on the 8 is not without significance, for 8 is a double quaternity, and as an individuation symbol in mandalas, plays almost as great a role as the quaternity itself. For lack of association material, we shall suggest only a tentative interpretation of the number 11 with the help of the traditional symbolism. 10 is the perfect unfolding of unity, and the numbers 1 to 10 have the significance of a completed cycle. 10 plus 1 equals 11, therefore denotes the beginning of a new cycle. Since dream interpretation follows the principle of post hoc ergo propter hoc, 11 leads to 8, the ogdoad, a totality symbol, and hence to an actualization of wholeness, as already suggested by the appearance of UFOs. I'm getting a message that the stream health is not good. I'm hoping that you can still hear me. I'm going to go ahead to the end, and then I'll come back and check this video. If it hasn't taken, I will reread it. Paragraph 693. The young lady, who seems to be unknown to the dreamer, may be taken as a compensating anima figure. She represents a more complete aspect of the unconscious than the shadow, since she adds to the personality its feminine traits. As a rule, she appears most clearly when the conscious mind is thoroughly acquainted with its shadow, and she exerts her greatest influence as a psychological factor when the feminine qualities of the personality are not yet integrated. If these opposites are not united, wholeness is not established, and the self as their symbol is still unconscious. But when the self is constellated, it appears in projection, though its true nature is hidden by the anima, who at most alludes to it, as in this dream. The anima, with her calmness and certainty, counters the agitation of the dreamer's ego consciousness, and by mentioning the number 8, points to the totality of the self, which is present in the UFO projection. Paragraph 694. The intuition of the enormous importance of the self as the organizer of the personality, and also the importance of collective dominance or archetypes, which are, as so-called metaphysical principles determine the orientation of consciousness, is responsible for the solemn mood prevailing at the beginning of the dream. It is a mood in keeping with the coming epiphany, though it is feared that this will unleash a world war or a cosmic catastrophe. The anima, however, seems to know better. Anyway, the expected destruction remains invisible, there being no real cause for alarm in the dreamer's vicinity except his own subjective panic. The anima ignores his fear of a catastrophe and eludes instead to his own death, which he can well say is the real source of his fear. Let me read that again. The anima ignores his fear of a catastrophe and alludes instead to his own death, which we can well say is the real source of his fear. Very often the nearness of death forcibly brings about a perfection that no effort of will and no good intentions could achieve. He is the great perfecter. Death is the he in this case. He is the great perfecter, drawing his inexorable line under the balance sheet of human life. In him alone is wholeness, one way or another, attained. Death is the end of the empirical man and the goal of the spiritual man, as the perspicacious Heraclitus says, quote, "It is to Hades that they rage and celebrate their feasts," unquote. Everything that is not yet where it ought to be, that has not yet gone where it ought to have gone, fears the end, the final reckoning. We avoid as long as possible making ourselves conscious of those things which wholeness still lacks, thus preventing ourselves from becoming conscious of the self and preparing for death. The self then remains in projection. In our dreams it appears as Jupiter, which in approaching the earth changes into a multitude of smaller heavenly bodies, into numberless selves or individual souls, and vanishes in the earth, i.e., as integrated with our world. This hints mythologically at an incarnation, but psychologically it is the manifestation of an unconscious process in the sphere of consciousness. Paragraph 696. Speaking in the language of the dream, I would advise the dreamer to consider the universal fear of catastrophe in the light of his own death. In this connection, it is significant that the conjectured year of his death falls in the middle of the critical period 1960 to 66. The end of the world would therefore be his own death, and hence primarily a personal catastrophe and a subjective end. But as the symbolism of the dream unmistakably portrays a collective situation, I think it would be better to generalize the subjective aspect of the UFO phenomenon and assume that a collective but unacknowledged fear of death is being projected on the UFOs. After the initial optimistic speculations about the visitors from space, people have recently begun to discuss their possible dangerousness and the incalculable consequences of an invasion of the Earth. Grounds for an unusually intense fear of death are nowadays not far to seek. They are obvious enough, the more so as all life that is senselessly wasted and misdirected means death too. This may account for the unnatural intensification of the fear of death in our time, when life has lost its deeper meaning for so many people, forcing them to exchange the life-preserving rhythms of the eons for the dread ticking clock. One would therefore wish many people the compensating attitude of the anima in our dreams, and would recommend them to choose a motto like that of Hans Hopfer, a native of Basel and pupil of Holbein. Quote, "Death is the last line of things. I yield to none." Unquote. So that is the end of that segment I intended to read, and it got to be an hour and 10 minutes. All right, so there are still quite a number of pages here, nearly over 60 pages left in this essay, which is quite a profound essay in terms of all of Dr. Jung's psychology. So I urge you to read it. It is found in Civilization in Transition, Volume 10 of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung. And I've been reading today from paragraphs 666 to 696, although the essay itself begins at page 589. So there's about 200 there are about 200 paragraphs in this essay, so it's a major essay. So my voice is again giving out on me, and thank you for being here today. I appreciate your watching today, and I will do my best to continue reading this essay until it's done. It's going to take a few more days to read it. So this has been part 4. You should go on to part 5.